taking notes can take down some of the, the definitions that I did give in some of the ayat. The ayah that I had quoted regarding where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls to the home of peace is chapter 10, verse 25. And this is the ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He is calling us to the home of peace, whereas there are many other calls in our life and in the dunya which are calling us to everything other than the home of peace. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is calling to that state, to that place. Next is the ayah that I quoted regarding the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent His messenger in order to give us knowledge and in order to purify us. That these are two requirements for this path to the source of peace, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's chapter 62, verse 2. And then we talked about the Sharia, the concept of Sharia, that the very definition of Sharia is it's the path to water. And that if we follow this path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's the only way that we're going to achieve the true source of peace. Now, this brings us to the idea of what does all of this have to do with fasting? What does all of this have to do with Ramadan? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us Ramadan in order to aid us in this process. Now, the way in which this happens is that we know that we have basically two things or two entities which prevent us from seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's basically two blocks that keep us from being good, from seeking that path to the source of peace and the source of water. And what are those two things? Those two things are Shaitan, which we know is our external enemy, and he is the source of this outer whispering that happens in our mind and in our heart. But there's a second aspect, there's a second block that keeps us from the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is the nafs. And that's what we're going to talk about inshallah today. The nafs is the inner inclinations. That's my own self. It's my inner inclination to do bad. Yeah, all of us, subhanAllah, we want to seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if we're believers, and the reason why we're on this call is because we want to seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but yet we're human beings, and we have ailments, we have inner ailments. Sometimes we get angry, sometimes we feel hatred, we feel selfishness, arrogance, prejudice, fear. These are all inner ailments which prevent me from attaining that peace by being near to the source of peace. And so in order to seek and in order to reach that source of peace, I have to clean myself of those inner ailments. And that is the process of tazkiyatun nafs. That's the process of training and purifying the self. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that when Ramadan begins, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet ﷺ, this is a hadith of the Prophet, and it's narrated by Bukhari. The Prophet ﷺ says that when the month of Ramadan begins, the gates of the paradise are opened, and the gates of hellfire are closed, and the shayateen, the devils, are chained. So this makes us kind of stop and reflect. Now, a lot of times we think, okay, we hear this hadith since we're young, and so we think, okay, we're going to go into Ramadan and we're going to become angels, right? Because now that shaitan is chained up, we should all be able to be angels. But what we find is that we're still not angels, right? Ramadan comes and we're still making mistakes, we're still sinning, we're still falling into error. And so then the question is why? Why is it that we continue to do that? Well, if you think about when you're in school and you're trying to figure out, if you're doing an experiment and you're trying to narrow down the cause of something, in order to narrow down what is the cause of a particular event, you have to eliminate other possible causes in order to see if it will still affect the event. Well, in this case, when Ramadan comes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is removing the other factor, which is shaitan. So anything that I do in Ramadan, I now know It's not from shaitan. I can't blame shaitan, because now shaitan is chained up. Now I can only blame my own nafs. So Ramadan is a time when we really learn about the nafs. Ramadan is a time when I have to face my nafs, because it's just me and my nafs. Shaitan is not involved anymore. And so Ramadan is a time when I encounter my nafs. And if I do wrong, there's no one else to blame. This is something, if there's anything I want, inshallah, us to take away from this talk, it's this, that true freedom. You know, we live in a society where they teach you that freedom is freedom of the self. But this is actually absolutely untrue. It's the opposite. True freedom is freedom from the self, not freedom of the self. And if there's anything you write down, I want you to write this down, that the true freedom of the human being is when they are free from their self, from their nafs, rather than having freedom of the self or of the nafs. To be truly liberated is to be free from the chains of my own self. That is true freedom. And freedom of the self is actually the opposite. Because when my nafs is free and my nafs is in control of me, then I'm actually a slave. I'm not free at all. So when people say things like, the idea of, a lot of times you hear this phrase of people say, follow your heart. But a lot of times when people say follow your heart, they really mean follow your nafs. And the reason for that is that sometimes when the nafs becomes so strong, it takes over the heart. And now the nafs is in charge, the nafs is in control. And so, when you become, enslaved to your nafs, that's not freedom, that's actually slavery. And indulging the self does something else. It disengages you from the freedom of exalting in more knowledge and more nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, what does that still have to do with fasting? Well, I want you guys to think for a second. If we are so busy in loving to eat, and that's what we do most of the time, what happens when our focus is on the physical pleasure? And when I say physical pleasure, that includes the physical appetite, basically, right? That when my focus is on the physical appetite of feeding my physical body, then that means that my focus is not on the spiritual aspect, the heart and the soul, because all I'm thinking about is what am I going to eat, what am I going to drink, what am I going to cook. And what I do is I'm seeking, and subhanAllah, I think probably at some point or at some level, a lot of us can relate to, when you're just feeling really stressed out, or you're feeling really sad, sometimes we'll go to food, right? We'll seek comfort in food. And I mean, there's that whole stereotype of like chocolate ice cream and us women and stuff like that. But the idea here is that there is some truth to this concept, that we do seek to fill some sort of void in ourselves through food. We seek to fulfill and to seek, to gain some sort of pleasure, but it's a physical pleasure, and it's again we're giving into the physical needs of the body. When you take away that focus, when you take away the focus from the physical need, now your focus is free to be directed towards the spiritual needs, towards the needs of the heart and of the soul. And by fasting, something that we realize is that we can find happiness in something other than the physical world. And that is extremely profound, that the idea that I can find pleasure and I can find fulfillment in something other than the physical, material world. And by leaving, food and drink and intimate relations, is that by doing that, I am finding that there's this whole other world where I can find a truer and deeper and realer, fulfillment and happiness that has nothing to do with the physical needs or the physical pleasure. The other aspect is that when I disengage from focusing on food, or again, just in general, the physical appetite or the physical pleasure, now I have been able to free my mind in order to engage intellectually with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and with I can focus on the deeper sorts of truths in my life. If my whole focus is having fun and indulging in all these different types of entertainment, then when am I really going to be engaged intellectually? So what Sawm does, what fasting does, is it liberates me from my addictions. Sawm is intended to liberate us. Allah disengages us from our addiction to food and drink so that we can realize that life is beyond the physical needs. There is joy and pleasure and happiness that is not physical and it's not materialistic. So that I don't think that the physical nourishment is the means to pleasure and happiness. And you'll notice that, subhanAllah, it's the same with prayers. Because if you think about salah, 5 times a day, I have to interrupt what I'm doing, which is usually something mundane or limited or material. And I have to interrupt that in order that I don't become dependent or addicted to that thing. By interrupting whatever it is I'm doing in my life throughout the day and going to pray, I am cutting myself off from it. And by doing that, I am preventing myself from becoming addicted, dependent, or a prisoner to what it is that I need to do daily. So I have to, obviously, I have to go to work, I have to interact with people, I have to do things of the dunya. I have to, obviously we all live in the dunya and we must live in the dunya. But the question is, how do we live in the dunya without becoming addicted, attached, and a prisoner to the dunya? And subhanAllah, Allah gives us exactly the prescription to be able to live in the dunya without being drowned by it, without being addicted to it, without being a prisoner to it. And so in the case of salah, by breaking away 5 times a day, I am disengaging from the dunya in a way that I can refocus